Welcome to part 7 of our series on the common tactics and effects of both the religious and the statist. Before we continue, I want to clear up some confusion about the word statist that's been going on in the comments. For the purposes of this video series, I'm basically using the word statist to cover anyone who isn't a libertarian. So a statist is someone who does believe that it's justified to initiate force against others in order to implement some public policy or another. Now, while this makes libertarianism and statism a true dichotomy, it should be pointed out that very few statists agree that this should be universally applied to every issue. But even if you agree with libertarians on everything else, if there's just one policy that you feel government should initiate force to implement, then at least in the context of that one policy, you're a statist and the complaints here apply to you. For example, the burden of proof is on you to defend your use of force to implement that particular policy, as stated in Part 1. So now that that's clear, let's move on to a very interesting phenomenon I like to call the paradox of interests. Here's the idea. There's something that benefits a few people that imposes costs on a much greater population. Let's say the ratio is 1 in 1,000. The interest group represents 0.1% of the population. And so we can use numbers for the purpose of illustration. Let's make it monetary. The 0.1% is doing something that takes money from the rest. Since the money given to each member of the interest group is taken from 1,000 others, then for every $10,000 one member gets, other people only pay $10 apiece. Now here's the important part. How much incentive do each of those members have to act to gain $10,000?
Yeah, I'm gonna do a lot. It's 10 grand!
And everyone else?
Why bother? It's only $10.
You can see how one-sided this is. No matter how much someone might be chagrined at losing $10, it just isn't worth the effort to try to stop it. Certainly not the same amount of effort one is willing to go to gain $10,000. There's actually a common scam based on this idea. A con artist makes up a whole bunch of fake invoices for $5 and sends them to 1,000 different companies. Since it generally isn't worth going through the whole accounts payable system to verify the invoice, a lot of them just pay it and move on. Let's say half of them do. 500 companies send him $5, and now he has $2,500, which he had to do very little to earn. The benefits are concentrated, but the costs are dispersed. So now you might begin to understand why there are so many lavish churches and parsonages, despite the fact that many church members donate to the church because of the good that it can do for others. Think of the extravagance of televangelists, or the Vatican. Just put a few dollars in the collection plate and multiply it by thousands of church members, or even millions of followers worldwide, all for a business that doesn't really have any sort of tangible product to offer. That tithe may just be 10% of your income, but the churches end up raking it in. It's not just about money, though. More insidiously, it's about power. No matter how many parishioners may feel it's their church, it's really just a few people making the rules, and rules that only slightly inconvenience individual church members can mean a lot of power for those in charge. Taken to extremes, this means that pedophile priests can abuse children for centuries, systematically supported by the Catholic Church itself, and even when people finally get around to raising a stink about it, neatly avoid prosecution. This is the paradox of interests. Priests and church leaders have a far greater incentive to keep the status quo as it is, or change it for their own personal benefit, rather than the rank-and-file members do to improve the church for their own benefit. The reason why is that the costs of these benefits the priests enjoy are spread out over a greater number of church members. So if they want to install gold-plated toilets, they have more of an incentive to work in favor of that than the church members do to oppose it. In the world of public policy, this is known as the political interest paradox, although as we've seen, it's hardly limited to politics. But we see it everywhere in our political system.
The problem with politics is all of those corporate lobbyists.
Okay, that's a problem. But when was the last time you went to Washington to try to stop it? This is the political interest paradox. Since benefits are concentrated but costs are dispersed, these corporations actually have a much bigger incentive to lobby politicians than ordinary people like you and me. The financial crisis is a perfect example of this, with things like the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, and Fannie and Freddie ready to step in and cover banks that made bad decisions that came back to bite them. And Congress certainly didn't help with bailouts and so-called stimulus money. You have a situation where profits are privatized, but losses are socialized. The risk to the profits the banks made resulted in costs that were spread out among a much greater population. Libertarians have their own saying for this expression: Tea Party syndrome. The Tea Party was initially formed as a libertarian movement to convince Congress to cut spending and put the budget on a better long-term sustainable footing. But as more and more powerful people got involved, and especially after the Republican infiltration, it became a living example of the paradox in action. They all want to cut spending, but not for their programs.
Let's cut funding to Planned Parenthood, but we shouldn't cut the military.
Over on the left, a lot of liberals countered,
No, we need to fund Planned Parenthood. It's the military we should cut.
Because of the paradox, the result will be to keep both Planned Parenthood funding and the big military, because both sides have a greater incentive to keep programs that they like than they do to cut the budget in general. We see this all the time among public polls, too. Many of them have found that, while a majority of Americans support cutting total spending, a majority oppose cutting funds for specific programs. Now, it's a different majority each time, and they're divided among whether spending should stay the same or increase, but you see the problem. Everyone agrees we should cut spending, but when it comes time to make specific proposals, you will always have those opposing the cuts, and they have far greater incentive to oppose cutting the funds than the rest of us do to support it. What this means is that the paradox of interests results in a status quo that everyone agrees is inefficient, but no one is willing or able to change.
Okay, so how would your free market be better?
In the free market, nothing is beyond reproach in this way, and what works today may not work tomorrow. If you have a business and you're doing something incorrect or inefficient or obsolete or in some way less than the best you could possibly do, then the incentive is there to change and improve your business. And if you don't or can't, you face the possibility of a competitor coming along and taking your clientele. If you can't do as good a job, there's a real chance you might even go out of business as people flock to your competitors.
And then people lose their jobs.
Well, short term, yeah, but this does not put people in impoverished situations, cast out and useless to society. It just means they go and do something else. Your workers will find work elsewhere, and you can create another business and hopefully apply what you've learned. But maybe not. Maybe you just don't have what it takes to be an entrepreneur. There's nothing shameful in that, any more than there is in not having what it takes to be a brain surgeon or a concert pianist. This is why we have workers. That isn't wage slavery or anything else like that. It's people utilizing the skills they have without having to take on the burdens of running a business when they have no talent as a businessman or no desire to do so. You see, different people are different. They have different preferences, goals, outlooks, and priorities. The paradox of interests turns them into a greedy mob, but the market works quite differently. Instead of trying to fit everyone into the same mold, the market recognizes and even encourages these differences and allows them to work together. Here's an illustration based on economist David Ricardo's work. Let's say you have the first two human beings in the world. Solely to upset the creationists, I'm going to call them Adam and Steve. Adam and Steve need lots of things to help them survive, but I'm going to focus on two tools they need: axes to chop trees and shape wood, and spears for hunting and fishing. Adam isn't too bad at either of these. He can make an axe in 3 hours and a spear in 4. But Steve is much better. He can make an axe in 2 hours and a spear in just 1. So he can make both of these in the time it takes Adam to make just an axe. This may sound to those of a Marxist bent as if Steve doesn't need Adam. He'll go on making his spears and axes, and poor Adam is left to suffer. But that's complete economic ignorance. Notice that Adam is better at making axes than spears, and Steve is better at making spears than axes. It actually doesn't matter that Steve is better at making axes than Adam is. This diversity leads to an economic exchange that makes both their lives better. Think about it. If there's no exchange, then Adam takes 7 hours making an axe and a spear, and Steve does it in just 3. But if Adam makes 2 axes and Steve makes 2 spears, then Adam is only working 6 hours and Steve just 2. They then trade an axe for a spear. They've each saved themselves an hour of labor, an hour that can be spent hunting or fishing, or making a shelter, or even just resting after a hard day. Multiply this by all of the different products and services in the economy and all of the people in the world, and you can imagine the wealth that comes to people as a result of the free market. In fact, you don't have to imagine it, just look around. Even the poorest person in America is better off than Adam or Steve, or even better off than the richest person in 1800. But the paradox of interests means that, in a situation run by government, these incentives are perverse. Since Steve only has to lose 3 hours making an axe and a spear, while Adam loses 7, then Adam has a much stronger incentive to lobby the government to take axes and spears from Steve than Steve does to lobby against it, because Adam gains 7 hours by doing so, but Steve only loses 3. Now multiply that economy-wide. The middle class, created by the free market, has been seeing fewer and fewer gains as government gets bigger, due to the paradox of interests. But in the free market, it's not a paradox. It's a recipe for making everyone, not just a few special interests, wealthier. There just isn't any way around this intellectually. So once again, the statists resort to the same tactics as the religious. Things like accusing their opposition's philosophy of being immoral. But that's part 8. Stay tuned.